We are living through a once-in-a-lifetime monetary reset.
Fiat currency is at high risk at this point in time.
The foundation of the system crumbling. There's a reason that nations are moving away from U.S. Treasury.
The world is sick of Washington, D.C.
Welcome back to the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference.
I'm curious in your perspective on how recent U.S. actions in places like Venezuela factor into how other nations and central banks think about reserve assets and financial sovereignty, aka gold. And so let's start with you, Colonel. These recent actions on Venezuela and does that mean central banks are going to be buying more gold or whatnot? Just curious in your perspective there.
But before we came out here, we agreed that the two ladies would talk first and answer these questions.
I knew you'd talk longer, so that's why.
Daryl.
We're going to have a drink tonight, y'all.
Okay, well, I'll give you a short answer. Last year when I was here, gold was at 2,500. Now it's at 4,500 and rising. And I suspect it'll go up to 5,000 or 6,000. That much is obvious. At the end of the day, it's substantive. Fiat currency, I think, is at high risk at this point in time. Now, I don't know what your previous panelists have said, but I'm someone who is very, very high on metals in general. Gold, silver, and all the commodities. And I think that's really where our focus ought to be. I wish the president would focus like a laser on these commodities. That's the foundation for everything. Remember, you see 10 F-35 aircraft. 9 out of the 10 F-35 aircraft exist because of China. And right now, there is a Chinese bureaucrat in Mongolia who decides who's going to get the rare earths. Remember, they process 90% of rare earths in the country. And that's a disaster. That's not a supply chain. That's a hostage situation for us. So one of the things that I've been trying to do for some time now, ever since I first went down to southern Kentucky and looked at the coal mining industry and found that they had rare earths in the seams, is to build a refinery here, preferably on the border with Canada. So it's centrally located, preferably near waterways as well as railroads and everything else. So when you ask me what's the impact of all these things, to me, that's the impact. We've had a wake-up call. We need to come to terms with reality. And we haven't done that. We're wasting so much money on defense right now. It's unbelievable because much of what goes into that defense pot, it really doesn't produce defense, frankly. We can't even audit it. So we need to take 1.2, 1.5 billion out of that right now and start building that refinery. And then we can access this as we need it. And large numbers of people will come to us from across the world to have their rare earths processed by us. I'm confident of that.
Okay, so just thinking about the recent actions, I mean, we went and extracted a foreign president and such, and so I'm curious in just like how other nations could be processing this. So if we're gonna, use either bully tactics, however you want to frame it, to get our way or whatnot, how are central banks going to be responding to this? Because it seems like if we don't agree with someone, and we go in and take whatever, there's got to be some type of consequence there, whether good or bad. And so I'm curious in your perspective on that, Jennifer.
I think it really reinforces the concern that reserves are being politicized. And so I expect that we'll see an increase in interest in the role of the special drawing rate, because that offers pooled resources and it makes it less effective to weaponize something like that. And then they'll be backed by gold, so that's where I see gold fitting in. But given that they're issued by a multilateral institution, and I think that would work quite well for the Middle Kingdoms collectively to be in something like an SDR. So I think that's what the future holds.
How about you, Ms. Kenney?
Yeah, a year ago, I was at VRIC, and I talked about the 4 forces accelerating the dollar's collapse, one of them being the weaponization of the dollar. And since then, we've only seen that snowball roll faster and faster down the hill, right? And this is no exception to that. There's a reason that nations are moving away from US Treasuries. There's a reason that over the last 25 years, the total share of US foreign exchange reserves has dropped from 72% to 56%, right? If I came to you, if I came to any of you tomorrow and said, hey, I've got an asset, it's neutral and safe, but it also can be frozen, it can be seized, it can be used against you, it can be devalued with the push of the button. Oh, and I forgot to mention, it exists inside a system that I control. Does that sound like a deal that anyone would take, right? I mean, trust has been broken, and at this point, I don't see that trust coming back, and that's where you move into something you can trust, gold.
Okay, so silver has recently been classified as a critical mineral. While maintaining a monetary history, what are the impacts of that? So you have industrial demand, monetary demand, investment demand, and now you have governments that are like, hey, this is critical to what we're trying to accomplish. And so just curious in your perspective on that, Colonel.
Well, I'm not sure, frankly, that we're really in the game yet. We're latecomers to this understanding of what is really critical. If you look at Venezuela, because you brought that up earlier, you're not going to control anything in Venezuela unless you go in on the ground. And anybody who wants to send troops into that place, which is the size of Germany, France, and Austria combined, with jungle and mountainous terrain similar to Vietnam, is crazy. In fact, a lot of my friends that are still in the Army staff said, yeah, Venezuela is Spanish for Vietnam. And they're right. The dumb idea to go down there. I think the lesson for us when it comes to these things is that we've got to do business with the governments that are there. The reason the Chinese have so much influence and rapidly cultivate business everywhere is that they don't walk in like the American and say, well, I'm sorry, but your human rights record is just not good enough. And we have to really tweak that before we can do anything for you. And of course, you know, the average person on the planet says, what are you wasting my time for? I asked you to come here and to talk business, and now you're insulting me, insulting my country, and you're saying we're not good enough to support, get the hell out of here. That's really what's happening. And then things like USAID and NED, what is it, National Endowment for Democracy, they're fronts to the CIA and regime change. All of that's got to go away. And that's why people voted for Trump. He was not voted to be a foreign policy president. He was voted to jettison that nonsense. So I think a big part of our problem is changing the way we interact with the rest of the world. That has to happen. We can't be a bully all the time.
Okay. Thanks, Colonel. I still want to get your perspective on silver.
I bought some, a lot, frankly. Listen, I never tell other people to do something I don't do myself. So I sold everything I have, all my real estate, home, everything, liquidated. I'm in cash, gold, and silver right now. Period. I sold my Bitcoin. Sorry, sailor, but I sold it.
Does he deserve a hand clap for that? We're going to make some enemies in here, Colonel.
By the way, you know that Mexico has 3 or 4 times the amount of silver in their mines than we do. So I'm waiting for someone in the White House to announce that we're going to intervene in Mexico.
Okay. What you think, Jennifer? What do you think about silver being a critical mineral and the governments needing this metal for defense and many other industries?
So I have an interesting perspective on this one. I think that I'm going to just do a little bit of speculating with this, because the U.S. is by far the largest importer of Canadian silver. 95% of our silver goes to them. And the USGS classified it as a critical mineral, and China refers to it as a strategic metal, but for some reason Canada didn't do it. And so I've been wondering, well, why would we not do that? And I like to look back at historical parallels, and I think it's notable that in 1934, when the United States passed the Silver Purchase Act, China, up until that point, had been on the silver standard. And that Silver Purchase Act caused this massive outflow of silver from China over to the US and plunged China into a Great Depression. And I'm seeing some things like the fentanyl situation. And if you think of that in the context of the opium wars, I'm kind of envisioning a reverse 1934 Silver Purchase Act scenario. And so I think maybe that's why Canada hasn't classified it yet as such, because if we did so, there's a little bit of an association there that our allies could be relied upon us for supply. And I don't think that that's the case. I can see our silver going elsewhere in the future.
Okay. What do you think about this, Taylor? What do you think about silver being classified as a critical mineral?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of stackers out there. Anyone you go to, if you say, pitch me on silver, one of the first things they're going to say is monetary and industrial, right? The dual role of silver, I think, is what's been so fascinating and so exciting for so many people for so long. I saw right before coming on stage, silver hit $106. I think we're still, still early, to be honest, because I don't think industrial demand, physical demand, which you can't fake, right, is slowing down anytime soon, especially when we think about, technology use, defense use. It's like you could have the nicest car in the world, but if you don't have gas to drive that car, it's not going to do you any good. It's just going to sit there. You need the gas, right? You need the silver. So, if that answers your question.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So what other major themes are you all watching for this year related to commodities, geopolitics, the monetary system, that you believe markets are not factoring in or they're underappreciating? And so, curious in your perspective there. We'll start here, Taylor.
I think the biggest thing is that too many people are still looking at what's going on right now as business as usual. I think that we need to zoom out and really look at the big picture, right? This is not business as usual. We are living through a once in a lifetime, a once in a multi-generational monetary reset. That changes everything. I talked a little bit earlier about US Treasuries, right? The foundation of the system crumbling. That's a big, big deal. And it just should not be taken lightly. I think, again, we're very early, especially when we think about gold. If you look at other currency resets, gold violently reprices against the failing fiat currency, but this is, again, the global reserve currency we're talking about. And it's not even just gold rising against the failing currency, right? We have to even think bigger than that now. Gold's being used as a settlement asset. It's being positioned at the center of the new system. So I just think we all need to think even a little bit bigger. If you're focused on daily micro price movements or just looking at one component, I think you're missing what's going on.
Okay, so we have some new investors in the room. I've talked to a few of them today. So could you explain what a monetary reset is?
Yeah, that's a great question I get asked all the time. People ask me, so what is a reset? Is it a process or is it an event? And the answer is it's both, right? It's a process that's marked by a series of events that culminates kind of in this final event. So typically it follows a pattern of overspending, overprinting, leading to inflation, a collapse of confidence, hyperinflation, and then eventually a currency officially being devalued, right? Lopping off zeros or revaluing it against another asset. That's the pattern that it typically follows. We obviously have inflation, we have a loss of confidence, we have overprinting, right? Again, that kind of process where people go, well, is it happening tomorrow? It's not the flip of a switch, but it is accelerating.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. Jennifer, what's your outlook on, we have the geopolitical issues, issues with the monetary system, commodities, just curious, and any thoughts that you have for 2026 and beyond?
There's three things that I would say that I'm watching. One of them is the implementation of the Basel endgame regulations, because that's going to really have a significant impact on the American economy. Congress has warned about it. The large banks have been protesting this. It's going to cause them to change their risk modeling, and there's an increase in capital requirements. So once that goes through, you could see a credit contraction, and that could have some serious implications. And I'll admit here, I don't own Bitcoin, but it's been fascinating to watch that one from afar. And a lot of the people I've talked to don't seem to really differentiate between crypto and stablecoin. And the Genius Act only refers to dollar-backed stablecoins, and then they came out with the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, I think it was last March that they announced that. But they were supposed to come out with some regulations after that, and it's been crickets on that. The Clarity Act, I haven't heard anything, but that Basel III, it classifies it as, I think it's got a 1,250% risk weight on it. So basically, crypto would be banned under that. So I think if people aren't aware of the difference, then they really need to do some more digging on that. And then the third thing, in history, there's been a remarkably predictable sequence that's occurred in commodities prior to conflict. And so they move in a certain order, and gold and silver tend to move first, and then it's uranium and copper, and then aerospace aluminum and nickel, and then you get into your explosives, ammonium nitrate, et cetera. But perhaps the Colonel can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that governments have, in history, usually suppressed oil prices in order to maintain economic and social stability. And so once you see oil prices rise, that's because concealment has failed. So I think people should be watching that price progression through those commodities, and I'm starting to see that, I think, myself.
Okay, thank you for explaining those indicators. Colonel, what's your outlook? Also, I need to get your perspective on this Greenland thing. When I looked at a chart, and there isn't much rare earths there compared to Brazil and I think it was China, but just curious in your perspective on that too.
Well, first I'd like to say that I agree with everything the two ladies have had to say.
Of course.
So, that's important. But there's one thing that I wanted to give the audience something to think about, and I've been thinking a lot about this. I'm watching the rest of the world. I'm watching this de-dollarization, which is actually picking up steam. And we're not talking a few countries. We're talking countries that are going to essentially put the so-called petrodollar at very high risk, if not out of business. You have the Saudis that are now doing business with the Chinese in yuan. You have the Saudis, or not the Saudis, but the Chinese that have established these gold exchanges, one in Riyadh and the other in Hong Kong, one with renminbi and so forth. I see the world in the future, and I don't know how long this takes, if it's a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, but I see a split occurring where one half of the world is going to fall in line with this thing we call BRICS, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia. And I think they'll have as many as 100 nation states aligned with them in a new financial system that is divorced from us. And we, and whoever is with us, some Europeans, I imagine, maybe the Japanese, perhaps some Latin American countries, I don't know. But I think we will then move into a system where it is not simply our fiat currency. We're going to look for things that we can back our currency with. But I also think there may be a role there for digital currency that is a little different from what we're imagining. And I don't think it's state-sponsored or state-owned, but independent of the central banks. In other words, we're going to move away from the system we have now, which is, faith in the dollar, in the great institutions and so forth, which is eroding pretty rapidly, let's face it. And I think the other side is going to be very heavy on gold, primarily, but also perhaps some other commodities. I don't know what else they would include. So there'll be two hemispheres, if you will, in a monetary or financial sense. I don't know all the details, but that's kind of what I see as a split. And we're not going to like it, but we brought it on ourselves. You can't bully people in the financial system relentlessly the way we have. We've talked about weaponization of the dollar, and everybody laughs, well, it's the dollar, you know. People have had it with us. The world is sick of Washington, D.C. Okay.
Hey, he landed that one home. So I do want to get your perspective on Greenland. What does this mean for commodities? Is this about commodities? Just curious, because that's been hyped up in the news. It's a lot of attention. I mean, gold even rose significantly on the news about Greenland and such. And so I'm curious in your perspective on that.
I understand there are a lot of job openings for seal watch and whale watch and penguin counting and things like this. I got to tell you something. When I heard this whole Greenland thing, I kind of laughed it off. And I told the audience earlier when I was speaking, we're already there. The United States Armed Forces stretches all across the Arctic. There's no reason for us to sit in Greenland. There's no reason for us to own Greenland. And when it comes to rare earths, there are plenty of places on the planet that have rare earths. The bottleneck is not the rare earths. There's plenty to extract. It's refining. And our unwillingness to compete. You've got to compete with China when it comes to this. They have the advantage of price stability. What does everybody want when you're in the supply chain? When you're selling something, buying something, you want price stability. We are going to have to subsidize energy for the rare earth refinery, because if we don't do it, we're not going to be able to compete. Now, I'm not saying that's permanent, but I'm saying if it has to be done, we need to do it. So I just think the whole Greenland thing is almost a distraction. I think it's unfortunate a lot of people were offended unnecessarily by it, and it's just not a major issue. But then again, I don't see any evidence that Russia or China are existential threats to us. Now, if you want to talk about Chinese economic power, that's a different matter. But I don't see any war developing unless we're dumb enough to start it. I hope we're not.
Okay, and lastly, I'm curious about the BRICS. So the BRICS was a hot topic, for a number of years. And at least for me, I feel like it's kind of went silent, but I know that you all still look into that. I don't know if we got enough time to even get into that, but is there any new developments with the BRICS or whatnot? Just curious in your perspective on that.
Well, since I have a captive audience here, I'd like to share some insight.
They're still awake.
Okay. Most of you know I was in the military and I served in something called the cavalry. But I've ridden very few horses, but we call it the cavalry still. It's armored reconnaissance aircraft and so forth. And when I was in graduate school, I had some time and I wanted to understand why we began World War II with thousands and thousands of horses and cavalrymen and horse-drawn artillery organized into two divisions. This is 1939. You would have thought, my God, what did we do during the 30s and the 20s? And I said, well, the generals are even dumber than I thought. Then I found something out that I never knew. There was a reason for all those horses. Every time the Army came forward and said, we want to buy X number of armored vehicles, tanks, new wheeled vehicles or something, the Congress wouldn't do it because there was an industry that I hadn't heard of, that the Army played a great role in. It's the horse shit industry. The horses produced enormous quantities of horse shit every year. And everybody packed that horse shit up, packaged it, and sold it to farmers all over the Midwest at bargain basement prices. Now, you can laugh, but there's value in horse shit. And the horse shit fertilized everything before we had the revolution with pesticides and chemical fertilizers and so forth. And what I want to leave you with is an understanding of something. The real lesson of all of this is number one, horse shit has a price. And number two, the collection point for most of the horse shit in the United States today is Washington, D.C.
All right, I think we need to end on that note. Shout out to the Colonel, shout out to our panelists, you all. Give them a round of applause.